So prior to 1967, the Jewish communities in America had built up a network of mutual support in the synagogues and the Jewish community centers. And there were 33 major Jewish organizations by 1967 when the Six-Day War occurred. And the B'nai B'rith, which had been in the existence since the beginning of the century and had stood for anti-bigotry and anti-Semitism, stopped the desecration of synagogues, perfectly valid society. The Anti-Defamation League, which had remained silent when the word began to come of whatever was happening, Germany was happening. The ADL became the most militant voice for Israel. And the creation of the Jewish state caused the Jewish leaders, and to try to get 20 or 30 of each leading citizen, each city in the United States, to be a good Jew meant that you had to support Israel. And I think probably the title Israel über alles, or Israel above all, became the watchword of the ADL. And they built up, starting in 1965 or thereabouts, an intelligence organization where to learn their enemies, people like Roy Bullock, who masqueraded as a kind of rotund antique dealer, first in the Midwest in Indiana, then he moved to Los Angeles, then to San Francisco. He would pass himself off as a sympathizer with whatever group was deemed by the ADL to be hostile to the state of Israel. And the purpose of the ADL, from trying to stop anti-Semitism and bigotry, by the 1980s had become to discredit any voice that was hostile to the policies of Israel, to cooperate with the demands of Israel, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. But the network that was built up prior to 1967 went into full gear under the ADL after the Six-Day War, not only to discredit people who spoke out against Israel, but to deny them forums. I heard one of your speakers say he was denied a debate. I've debated nearly everybody. I've debated Meir Kahan in front of 2,000 Jews in San Francisco. I've debated Jerry Rubin of the JDL. No ADL leader will debate me on the subject of Israel. I've forgotten who the speaker was that didn't they offer $250,000 or $500,000 if the ADL makes a conscious choice. If there is a skilled debater or a skilled scholar on the other side, they won't debate. If KQED or a public television station wants to have a debate in the Mideast, they'll call the ADL first, who speaks for the Jewish community. They'll call whoever is on the other side. I'm president of a group called Americans for the National Interest. Paul Finley and I founded that organization a few years ago. Some of you may be members of it. All we're trying to do is to get an equal voice with the Israeli lobby. But when they call the ADL and they say, would you debate Mr. McCloskey or Congressman McCloskey or Senator Percy or Senator Adlai Stevens? No. The ADL does not want the facts to come out. They want to suppress any facts that are critical of Israel. So if you understand that that's their goal, above all else, preserve the special relationship between Israel and the United States, preserve a good public opinion of Israel on the part of the American people so that the money keeps coming, defeat anybody like Paul Finley or Chuck Percy or even Ed Shaw, who was defeated mainly by Jewish money here in Southern California for the Senate. You understand that their purpose is to discredit and to deny a forum to anybody. So, of course, the IHR would immediately become a large bullseye and a goal and a target of the ADL. Now, when they build up this intelligence organization, I would guess, I would be almost certain that somewhere in this room is someone who is a member of the ADL or reporting to the ADL. Because you have no way to assure that everyone who comes to this room is what he says he is. Bullock would go to the American Arab Anti-Discrimination League. He'd say, I'm in sympathy. Let me pass out your literature. Then he'd go out in the parking lot at a meeting where a group, my wife got listed. She was on a thing called Proposition W up in San Francisco, which was to cut aid to Israel by the amount of money they were putting into the settlements on the West Bank and Gaza. So she became targeted because she was taking a view hostile to Israel. When the San Francisco police first learned that, I got a call from a police captain. He said, Mr. McCloskey, in the records of the San Francisco ADL is a note that when your wife crossed from Jordan into Israel in 1987, she was involved in an altercation at the Allenby Bridge. Well, I was with her at the time, Jim Abereski, remember the senator from Arab American Senator of North Dakota, South Dakota. We had visited Jordan. My wife wanted to go across and see Jerusalem, Jericho. Crossing the bridge, there were 5 young women in their 20s, early 30s. The Jewish border guard stopped them, and 4 of them, my wife with a name like McCloskey or Smith or Jones, no problem. One of the girls was named Aziz, an Arab name. She'd married a young Arab American. All 5 American citizens. The Israeli border guard turned to the one named Aziz and said, take off your clothes. It's a humiliating, it's a demeaning experience. My wife was offended, spoke of her offense, but to find 6 years later that to turn up in the office of the San Francisco Anti-Defamation League meant that information was coming the other way, as well as going from America to Israel. Victor Ostrovsky, of the former member of the Mossad, has written about the cooperation of the American Jewish community with the Israeli government. In the ADL's case, they wanted to ingratiate themselves with police departments so that they could get information from police departments about anti-Semitic activity or anti-Israel activity. The years that Bullock got in trouble, the ADL spy, the way he was caught, he would come to a meeting like this, he'd sit down, he'd go out in the parking lot, and he'd take the license plates of all the cars in the parking lot. And then he would take the license plate numbers. Here's a list, Tom, to Tom Gerard of the Police Intelligence San Francisco. Would you get me the names of these people? And back would come the name and the address of the people that owned that car and a notation. These people are anti-Israel, or they're pro-Palestinian, or they're peacemaking on the war in Vietnam. And that information would then be funneled to the Los Angeles office of the ADL, to the New York office of the ADL, to the Washington, D.C., and to whatever local office was involved. Portland, Oregon might get it. The 31 major cities, including Tel Aviv, with offices of the ADL, were on constant communication. And they built up these dossiers so that if you wanted to call and find out if a person was anti-Israel or had ever said anything that was anti-Israel, you call this number, the guy on the line in Los Angeles, 30 seconds later he can come back and say no or yes, which would condemn you. Well, I had spoken out against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the use of cluster bombs. I had been known as a relative friend of Israel up till that time. The Jews quite often had views that I shared on issues like Vietnam or women's right of choice, things of that kind. But once I took one position that was deemed hostile to the state of Israel, I was a marked man. I came back and ran for the Senate in 1982. I'd been in the House 15 years. And let me tell you what happened. I'll give you 3 examples. My finance chairman in Southern California was a savings and loan executive. He was a very loyal man. He'd known my father. He wanted to help me. He thought I'd make a good senator. There was a savings and loan crisis in 1982, you may remember. 3 of his biggest Jewish depositors came to him and said, Mr. X, we see you're the chairman of this finance committee. You get off that committee, or we will withdraw our deposits. So now you had the coupling of economic power. Advertisers. If a radio talk show or a television talk show indicated sympathy with the Palestinian cause, the station would be deluged with calls. This man's anti-Semitic. Any comment. The threat of anti-Semitic Semitism, as you know, in the academic community, nobody wants to be called a bigot or anti-Semitic. But the ADL in this period of time, you've seen the new books, the new anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism. And no longer is this Jewish political, the liberal political thought of the 30s. Now the support of Israel is the primary obligation of every Jew. You're not a good Jew unless you are speaking out for Israel or doing your part to defend Israel against unjust criticism. When I left the Congress, I lost that Senate race to Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson, the Republican, went up to San Fernando Valley and made a promise to the Jewish leaders of that highly powerful Jewish area that if elected to the Senate, he would favor the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. That story was reported and absolutely hushed up. You've never heard the story since. The Jewish community has the power to suppress, either by advertising or control of the media, stories that are hostile to Israel, and they have the ability to discredit anyone who speaks out. And that's their purpose. I'm going to give you a couple examples of what they've done to friends or clients of mine. And you'll recognize this goal to preserve a good public opinion of Israel. In 1983, two young women that were wives of Arab professors at San Jose State and the University of California, Carol Al-Shaib and Audrey Shabbos, had a little educational program to try to educate people about Muslim culture, Arab culture. And they would put on seminars and they would teach people about the history of the Mideast. They quickly came under the eye of the ADL as being threatening to Israel because they were speaking of justice for Palestinians. They entered into a contract when the Saudi art exhibit came to San Jose. It was going to be hosted by the San Jose Art Museum Foundation, I believe was the name of it. It was run by 21 leading citizens. The chairman happened to be Jewish. Carol and Audrey were going to put on two speakers, a lady from Texas who had spoken for Palestinian rights. One of the members of the board thought he'd heard the name, and he called the local ADL representative, a Professor Brenner, up at the University of California, famous professor. And Brenner said that those people are anti-Israel. The two women had invested about $5,000 to put on this sort of 4-day expression. They'd sent letters out to all school teachers. They were called up in front of the board and told them that they were going to have controversial speakers and they were going to cancel this. Well, these are two women that are going to make $15,000 off a seminar and probably pay half of $10,000 of it in expenses. But the ADL had effectively ended their ability to earn a living in teaching people about the Arab world.